dedicated to each and every one of you who appreciate a great glass of wine. You know what I mean?
It's Monday. Let's raise a glass to the beginning of another week. It's time to unscrew, uncork, or saber a bottle, and let's begin exploring the wine glass. Today, I am sitting down with Dave McGee, owner and co-winemaker at Monochrome Wines in Paso Robles. The winery is located in Tin City and specializes in the production of unique and complex white wines. Dave decided to follow his heart, try out some new ideas, and have fun, and that is exactly what he has accomplished. Join us as we discuss his methodical and experimental approach to producing incredible white wines. Hey everybody, I'm Lori Budd, a UC Davis winemaking program, someday service, champagne specialist, and WSET Level 2 graduate. You can find Exploring the Wine Glass on all the socials, as well as your favorite podcast catchers. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time to swipe, subscribe, rate, and review. I promise I'll never tell you what to drink, but I'll always share what's in my glass.
Oh, no, never let you go.
I want to give a big shout out to Alfonso Leonardo Tasty for leaving this 5-star review. Great podcast, very informative, makes you want to come back for more. Awesome indeed. Thank you, Alfonso, for listening and for leaving this fantastic review. This truly is the best way to show support of the podcast and to help let other wine lovers find Exploring the Wine Glass. Everybody, welcome to another episode of Allure of the Poor, sponsored by Jurassic Wines. I am your host, Lori, a WSET Level 2 graduate, a champagne specialist, and owner of Jurassic Wines in Paso Robles. And I am very excited today to have Dave McGee with me, another Paso winemaker. Welcome, David. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation.
Okay, so normally my very first question is the origin story. How did you get into wine? All of that. But I have to go off my typical here, and I have to go with change my first question, because your background, you started your career was really in working with electrophysiology. And I read that. I was like, oh my God, that's like amazing. So it's responsible for like the heart and all of that. How did you get into that field first? And then how do you go into that field into wine?
Well, first of all, electrophysiology wasn't my first career. It was, I don't know, second or third career, I guess. I originally got a couple of engineering degrees and went into the aerospace business. And I worked at one of the big aerospace companies down in the Los Angeles area, doing primarily radar and stealth aircraft design. So I did that for a number of years down there, and then figured it was time to do something different. Didn't know what that something different would be. Went back to business school, got a business degree up in the Bay Area. And from there, I got into the medical field. And so I worked at a bunch of medical technology companies up in the Bay Area, some startups, some bigger companies. I worked in electrophysiology. I worked in interventional cardiology, interventional neuroradiology, orthopedics, spine, urology, a couple of other things.
Wow.
And so did that for about, 15, 20 years, something like that. And then from there, I really started making wine in my garage as a hobby when my wife and I lived up in the Bay Area. And then I got a little more serious. I took the online version of UC Davis's winemaking program. And about that time was when we kind of figured we'd had about enough of the Bay Area rat race. It was time to do something different and go somewhere else. And I'd grown up in Bakersfield, so I was familiar with the area. We came down here, we loved it. We loved the wines being made and figured we would just move down here and figure the rest out later. So we did. Still didn't know whether I really wanted to go in the wine business or not, but I figured I should probably work for a couple of local wineries and get my hands dirty, literally, and figure out if it was something I wanted to do. So I worked at Via Creek and Alta Colina wineries for a couple of years before starting up Monochrome.
Wow. So Bakersfield, my college roommate was from Bakersfield, and I did spend my freshman year, I did spend Thanksgiving there. And
Yeah.
yeah, and some other break. It wasn't spring break because I know we weren't going to Bakersfield for spring break. But
Yeah.
but yeah, I went to school at Whittier, so down by LA. So we took
Okay.
that drive up to Bakersfield.
Well, we
Yes.
used to always joke that growing up in Bakersfield was great because you were 100 miles from anything you'd want to do. If you wanted to go to the ocean, it was 100 miles. If you wanted to go to LA, it was 100 miles. If you wanted to go to the mountains or the desert, it was 100 miles. The bad thing was you were 100 miles from anything you wanted to do. So there you go.
So so again, we're originally from New Jersey. My husband and I are from New Jersey, but we have the winery in Paso, and then he got offered a job in Fresno.
Okay.
So we live in Fresno, which is a lot closer than flying 6 hours and then driving 3 hours to get to the winery. But that's similar to Fresno. When we were here looking at houses, everybody just was like, "Oh, Fresno's great. You can get anywhere you want in like 2 hours. You can go skiing in
Right.
2 hours. You can do this in
Right.
2 hours." Yeah, I'm like, but does everybody
Yeah.
just leave? And everybody just leaves on the weekends. Like
Yeah.
it's like mass exodus.
Yeah, well, certainly where we live in Paso, we don't live not too far from 46 going east over to the Central Valley. And on pretty much any given Friday afternoon, that road is full of people coming from the Central Valley to come over to Paso or Pismo Beach or San Luis Obispo or something like that.
Right. And the same is going out on Sunday evening.
Right, same thing.
Right. Okay. So you started making wine in your garage, and
Mhm.
what were you making, and how were you getting your grapes? I mean, I guess from the Bay Area it's a little easier, but what were you making?
Well, so first of all, the style of winemaking at Monochrome is directly following on what I did in the garage. But I
Oh,
started out, we lived up in the Bay Area, and there was a place that specialized in, you could get like a big 10-gallon pail or a couple 10-gallon pails of either frozen must if you were making red wines or frozen juice if you were making white wines. And they had found sources that were pretty decent vineyard sources, most of them either in California or Washington State. And so the first time I got a couple of 10-gallon pails of Sauvignon Blanc juice from a vineyard up in Washington State somewhere. I forgot the exact name of the vineyard, but basically you just thaw it out and you go from there. So I was sort of experimenting and playing with things. I thought, well, okay, I'll try to make a couple different versions of this. I'll make one that's more of a Sancerre style, sort of a little bit on the clean side, minimal oak characteristics. And then I made another one that was a little bit more California Bordeaux style. And, just treated them different, treated each little carboy that I was working with differently just to sort of see how they would behave and how they would change. And it came out pretty good. I think the highest compliment I got, some neighbors of ours were French, and they had the woman's mother and father were visiting from France, and I poured some of this, and they're like, "Oh, this tastes like a Sancerre," and I was thinking that's kind of what I was hoping for, but I wasn't really
you're like,
expecting it.
yay!
So yeah, that was. I tried not to look too overly excited about it, but that was kind of fun.
And that's like the beginning of all ending too, right? Once you're doing it just for yourself, and then somebody tastes it and they're like, "Oh, this is really good." And then that voice goes off in your head. "Oh, maybe I should do this
Yeah.
more. Maybe I should do this for real," right?
Yeah, so I did that for I think once or twice up in the Bay Area, and then about that time we moved down here. And so when I moved down here, I was working just basically acting as a cellar rat at a couple of other wineries. But on my off time, I was able to talk some of the local vineyard owners into selling me some fruit, and so I was making it directly from fruit in that case, and crushing the fruit and. Mainly whites. I did some Syrah. I did a couple of other things on the red side, but a little bit more on the white side.
Okay, and then when you first started when you first started Monochrome, you were doing double duty, right? You had you had a job on top of the winery. Are you still doing that, or are you 100%?
No, I was, once we moved down here, I was still doing a little bit of consulting in the medical field for a couple of years, but by the time I started Monochrome, I'd phased out of that. And so I've just been focused on Monochrome since I started that. But yeah, it's been fun.
Okay, so now the thing that caught my eye is, and you've alluded to it, is that Monochrome is all about the white. It's all about white wines. So what about white wines calls your name that you're like, this is what I am focusing on? Because I don't know too many wineries that do that. In fact, I can't really think of any that focus on whites. There's loads that focus on red.
Right.
So what about white that calls your name?
You know, I think my wife and I have always enjoyed white wines. I think my wife usually prefers white wines, although we drink a bit of both. Some of it was also just the contrary nature that I have, and some of it was also you look, as you suggested, at Paso, for example, I think at the last count, there are about 350 wineries in the area, and substantially 349 of them now are focused either exclusively or primarily on red wines. And you go into most of them and they'll have one or maybe two white wines. And some of them make a serious effort at making really nice white wines. But a lot of them, I think it's fairly clear that it's not really where their passion is. You know, they don't put as much energy and effort into making top quality, complex, interesting white wines as they do into their reds. You know, and the white wines, a lot of them are a little bit, you know, kind of second-class citizens in the sense that they take the juice, they put it in a big stainless tank, they ferment it, it comes out nice and crisp and refreshing, but definitely doesn't have the character, the complexity, the interesting aspects that you can get from the best red wines. And that was really what sparked my attention, both the fact that, you know, I didn't want to be just number 351 doing red Rhone blends or red blends period around here. But it also just seemed like there was a need and an opportunity. You know, white wine seemed to be underserved both literally and figuratively around here. And I think that's really what sparked me to go down this road, along with a lot of encouragement from my wife on that point.
Well, you have to find your own niche, right? You have to be able to, you know, stand out amongst everybody else, right? You don't want to be that little itty bitty, you know, fish in a massive, massive pond. And Paso is really kind of a massive pond in some respect. So you have to be able to find a way that makes you stand out from everybody else. So I get it. And I love the name Monochrome. So what did you come up with the name? Did your wife come up with the name? How did that whole evolve?
I came up with the name, and there were a couple of reasons why I thought it would work. We went through a lot of different brainstorming ideas, but you know, monochrome technically means one color, right? So given that we were only going to do white wines, that seemed to fit. But I also saw a parallel there. I'm a bit of a photography enthusiast, and I saw a parallel to photography in the sense that some people at first glance think about black and white or monochrome photography as being less complex or less interesting than color. And yet most fine art photography is done in black and white. And most photographers will tell you that it's harder to make a black and white photograph work because you can't just rely upon a pop of interesting color to hold someone's attention. You've got to get all the basics right. You've got to get the subject matter, the composition, the tonality, or it just comes out flat and boring. And I think it's similar with wine. You know, with red wine, you can throw a lot of oak and tannin and extraction and cover up for a lot of things. But with white wines, you really don't have that luxury. You've got to get the basics right. You know, the flavors, the acidity, the balance, complexity, that sort of thing, or it just comes out kind of flat and boring. And there are a lot of white wines that are very quaffable, but at least in my opinion, sort of one-dimensional and boring. And those are all the things that went into thinking that monochrome would be a good name for what the project was all about.
And the the label, or when you look at monochrome, it's got I'm going to hold up this beautiful bottle for the people who are going to watch it to see. I don't know, the light is killing it. The O, in the monochrome, in the chrome part is green. Is that a shutter? Is that
Yeah, that O is kind of representative of an aperture blades in
okay?
camera lenses. But
I used the wrong term.
yeah, the green color really was chosen very specifically for this because I didn't want it to be just the standard gold, silver, red, black that everybody uses in the wine industry. I wanted something that was going to be stand out and be reflective of what we were doing. And so if you look at the color of white fruit, it's actually shades of green going into shades of yellow, depending on the variety and the degree of ripeness and all that. And so I actually took a lot of photographs of white grape clusters and sort of broke down the colors. And a good friend of mine had done a lot of design and worked at a big ad agency down in LA. And so he helped me with laying out the overall label design and the logo design.
I love it. It is simple and complex at the same time, and that is white wine also, right? It can be simple, but you're finding the complexity within it so that it's not just the, sit on the back porch and pound and don't even know what you're drinking white wine.
Right.
But I love it. And that, the color, you brought up the colors. When I tell people that, white grapes go through veraison also, and there's shades of that. And I think that's not a very well known fact out there, that it does go through veraison. I would love to see some of those photos. Do you have your photography in the tasting room? Do you have your?
I do. Yeah, I have probably about, I don't know, 8 or 9 photographs that I've blown up and framed and hung on the walls of the tasting room. Of course, we haven't actually done any tastings indoors for the last year, so it's all been out of the patio.
We're opening.
Yeah, we're reopening now. We're going to reopen actually on next Friday because the weather is so horrible here right now. Nobody will want to sit outside and get rained on, so we'll give it an extra week and open next Friday.
Okay. So I am thirsty. I have been waiting since you shipped me these to try these. So I want to get into the tasting, and then we'll go on with these.
Let me tell you a little bit about the philosophy behind these wines and how they're made. And it really does stem from when I was first making wine in the garage. At first, you don't know what you're doing. You don't know what the best fermentation temperature, the right amount of oak, the right strain of yeast, any of that stuff is. So being a trained scientist, I figured I would do a bunch of different versions, change those parameters around, figure out which was the best, and then make them all like that. But what I actually learned was having a lot of different versions that were all made differently, intentionally, and therefore had different flavors and different aromas and different textures to them, gave me a lot more to work with when it came time to blend. And at least to my palate, resulted in wines that had more character and complexity than if I just put it all in one big tank or one big barrel and made it all the same. I always draw the comparison to cooking. If you're cooking and you only had 1 or 2 ingredients, you're kind of limited. But if you have a whole pantry of different things that you can pull from, you can come up with something a little bit more interesting and complex and have more fun doing it. So that's pretty much what we do. Each barrel is intentionally done differently, just to spread the range of flavors. And it's remarkable. A lot of people talk about terroir and all that, but same fruit, picked from the same vineyard, harvested the same day, and each barrel is just totally different.
Absolutely.
Because of the way we treated it and made it going down the road.
And now,
then try to just layer them back together again to bring out different elements in the wine and try to add a little bit more complexity to them.
Okay, and going further on what you're talking about, you can have the same cooperage and the same toast and everything in that barrel, and barrel A with the same, like you said, same grape, same harvest date, same chemistry, into barrel B, and they're going to be different. So are you doing that in addition to having different cooperages and different toasts? Like, are you like a mad scientist back there in the barrels? And
We're definitely accentuating those characteristics. I sat down when I first started doing monochrome and thought, well, what are all the different levers you can pull in the winemaking side that will create different characteristics in the resultant wine? Well, you can ferment it at different temperatures, for example. Okay. You can ferment it with different yeasts. You can use different regimens for barrel stirring. You can use new oak of various cooperages. You can use neutral oak of various cooperages. You can use stainless. You can use amphora. And we do all of that. So each barrel is intentionally treated differently. We might have one where we ferment at a higher temperature, one we ferment at a lower temperature. This one might be new oak. That one might be neutral oak. Some of the barrels, we ferment dirty, so to speak, which is basically you take the juice right out of the press with grape particles and things still in it. Don't let it settle, but go straight to the barrel. And then others, we would do a 24 or 48 hour cold settle to reduce those particles coming out. But again, it makes for remarkable differences from barrel to barrel when you pull all those levers and do everything intentionally differently.
And I saw on your tech sheets, you're also doing some skin contact also.
Mm-hmm.
So that adds a whole other dimension.
We do some skin fermentation for those of you who might not be so familiar with that. That's basically making a white wine the way you normally would make a red wine. So rather than just fermenting the juice, you ferment it on the skins. And then when it's dry, then you press it from the skins the same way you would making a red wine. So do some of that. When we use that, it's usually within 2 to 8% of the overall blend. I've done some carbonic maceration with Albarino, which one of the wines that I sent you has some component that was done that way. And it's really fun. It just brings out totally different elements. And some of them, to go back to the food analogy, you might not want to drink a whole bottle just of that component by itself. But it's like when you're cooking and you have an onion. You might not want to eat a whole onion by itself, but you throw a little bit of onion into a dish and it can do some really remarkable things and add some interesting notes. And that's the way I think about some of these components that we do, where it's skin fermented, carbonic, this, that, and the other.
So I'm just thinking of how much is going on in that, during that fermentation and even during barrel storage, and, are you keeping them on lees? Are you not keeping them on lees? Like you must have a data log of so much information to keep track of, of each of these different variables.
Right.
And then,
yeah, they're kind of excruciatingly labor-intensive wines, I guess you'd say. And it's funny. I make the wines at Onyx's facility. Drew, of course.
yes.
So Drew and his gang do a lot of the actual hands-on work for me, and I think they get a real kick out of it because, particularly their interns, get an exposure to a lot of unusual stuff that they would never otherwise see. And, I'm frequently doing things that I think they're scratching their heads about a little bit initially, but I think they've come to accept it and appreciate it at this point.
And I think that on your website, I think that plays really well into what you have on your website of saying that we had to follow our hearts and try out some new ideas and have fun. So that is, you're doing it. You're doing it.
Yeah, one of the things I enjoy about winemaking is the creative part. I wouldn't want to feel like I'm just making the same wine that somebody else has already made, or just turning the crank and making the same wine year after year.
Right.
So consequently, all the wines tend to be totally different from year to year. Don't make any effort to replicate what we did last year, basically.
Now you have some pretty interesting names. Like the ones you sent me were Barrel Distortion, Neither Here Nor There, and Sense of Out of Place. So I was looking, you have those same wines last year, the previous vintage, but there's just you don't have a set of what it's going to be. You're going into your blending trials and saying, this is going to become this is going to become this.
Yeah, some of them we repeated. We made a version of barrel distortion every year. Neither here nor there. We've only made twice out of the 4 years that we've bottled at this point. And since About a Place, we only made once.
Once, okay.
But they all, even the ones where we do the same name, they're really different wines because it's more how it turns out that particular vintage. And it's really what works out during the blending session. It usually takes about 4 or 5 passes to get all the blends worked out. It can ultimately be fun and a nightmare.
I was gonna say, so if anybody has ever seen a blending trial go on, it's a whole bunch of graduated cylinders and Erlenmeyer flasks and glasses and spits, spit cups and all that stuff. And I'm thinking, your table must be completely filled with the samples. Like how many? So let's talk about this wine, the Neither Here Nor There. So this one is 56% Chenin Blanc and 44% Sauvignon Blanc. Now you're blending that all together, but you have barrel fermented, you have, skin contact, you have, so take us through what's in your mind as you're going through these blending trials.
So yeah, I'll give you kind of an overview just generically of what those look like. And I should also say that the people that are involved in this, basically myself, and then Riley Hubbard, who's also another Paso winemaker, and she's been involved in this project, sort of helps provide a different perspective. She's kind of a collaborator on this. And then I usually run the blends by my wife when Riley and I think we've got them about nailed down just to get an outside perspective. But I mean, back to your question, the way it works, let's take 2018. We had, we had 8 different grape varieties that we worked with that vintage. But because we intentionally make each barrel totally different, we really made 48 different wines. Okay. So the first pass, you go through and you taste all the barrels just to get a sense for what they're tasting like. And even though you're spitting it all out at that point, your palate is just shot after 48 samples. And you have to have the discipline to say, okay, time out. Let's take a couple of days or a week off. And then you start to formulate some ideas of what you might try. And you come back with your calibrated beakers and you say, well, let's try 30 milliliters of this plus 20 of that and 15 of this. And well, maybe a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that. Let's try a little bit of this over here. And then you blow your palate out again. And then you come back 3 days or a week later, and then you try to keep refining it. And my guardrails I use are, I want to make sure each wine by itself is interesting and flavorful and well balanced, but I also want to make sure they're all unique from each other and they don't all start to taste the same. And that's something that I really aim for. If you taste all the wines in a given vintage, they're all quite different, even though they're all white, and that's intentional. And then finally, you hope to find a home for all the individual barrels and kegs that you have, so you don't have a bunch of wine left over you don't know what to do with. But we really don't make any effort to do single variety or single vineyard or conventional blends or even what we did last year. It's more what works out that particular vintage.
So you're coming up with these, I have to give you credit because first of all, we all, forget the name of the winery because that's a whole other ball game of making sure there's nobody out there and all of that stuff. But coming up with these names, every vintage is incredible. So you're a very you're creative also, which is you can. Everybody says winemaking is art and science, right? But as you've mentioned, it's not always portrayed in the wine. Okay. This is a piece of art. This is a beautiful wine that has so many different levels in the aromas. And then when you taste it, each time you taste it you're like, oh, look at that. And I can envision it being, okay, this was because you pulled from this barrel, or this was because you pulled from this tank, or you did this to that. And it is a complex wine. It is not a wine that this is going to sound, this is a huge compliment, so take it as it means. It is not a wine that you just want to sit and drink. Like you want to contemplate this wine, and it's a full-bodied wine, which but it's also light. It's kind of what's the term I'm looking for? An oxymoron. It's light and complex. It's light and full at the same time.
That's kind of what we hope for, you know. And you mentioned the art side of things. I think I get more inspiration from other forms of art and creativity than I do from winemaking as a whole. And you know, I think if you look at other forms of creativity, whether it's you know, cooking or music or architecture or painting or fashion or what have you, you really expect new people to do something different and not just do the same thing that everybody else has been doing. They have their own style, to do something creative and interesting. And moreover, you expect people to kind of continue to evolve and change throughout the course of their career. And yet wine, frequently, it's like, you know, you look at Bordeaux, right? Bordeaux's great, but they've been doing the same thing basically for 170 years or whatever. And again, I mean, to each their own, but for me, I enjoy when I'm drinking wine or tasting wine, I like tasting something that I haven't experienced before. And if I had to drink the same wine every night, even if it was a great wine, I'd get bored with it. And so that's really what I look for, both from my own wines and from other wines that I try to find and encounter.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Exploring the Wineglass is brought to you by Jurassic Wines. Jurassic Wines is an artisan winery located in Paso Robles, California. They have been producing wine since 2013. Their first vintage began with one wine, their classic Cabernet Franc, which received a 91 in Wine Enthusiast. Since then, they have increased production as well as expanded their portfolio, have received many accolades including multiple double gold medals and consistent 90+ ratings. Visit their website www.dracinawines.com or use the link in the show notes to schedule a private tasting and to see their entire portfolio. Purchase your award-winning wine and let Jurassic Wines help turn your moments into great memories.
So this is actually Chenin Blanc, 56% Chenin Blanc and 44% Sauvignon Blanc. So are these from single vineyards of Chenin Blanc and single vineyards of Sauvignon Blanc? And then you're treating them differently, or are you even going into different vineyards?
No, they're both from, the Sauvignon Blanc is from one vineyard, which is McGinley. It's down in the Happy Canyon area near Santa Barbara. And then the Chenin is from a different vineyard. It's called Jurassic Park. It's down in the Fox and Canyon area. But once we get the fruit in, we start doing different things with it. And so each barrel is intentionally treated differently. And this wine is not the entirety of all the Sauvignon Blanc barrels and all the Chenin barrels. And they're the ones that kind of worked well in this particular blend. And then there's 6% of it was skin fermented, the Sauvignon Blanc, which really brings out some interesting aromatics. It has a touch of that kind of grassy grapefruit characteristic you would get from a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc.
But it's just a hint. It's not the New Zealand in your face. It's
right.
It's to kind of let you know there's Sauv Blanc.
You're asking about the names, and the reason for this one is that, as I indicated in the note, it sort of originally, the first time we made it, it started off with this idea we make something that at its starting point was a little bit more like a Sancerre inspired take on Sauvignon Blanc. But then we added some Chenin Blanc, which kind of brings in the lower Loire area. And then we added the skin fermented component, which brings a little bit, at least on the nose, from the kind of the Sauvignon Blanc that you'd get in New Zealand, a little bit of that grassy grapefruit characteristic, but the palate is totally different than anything you would get in New Zealand. So consequently, the idea was it pulls influence from a lot of different wine growing areas, but it's kind of its own thing. It's very distinctively its own. I had one sommelier say it was probably the least Paso wine ever made in Paso, which I think he intended as a compliment. You know.
It is, and going back to the palate, it is, the acidity is there. It's a well-structured wine, but it's not the New Zealand acid bomb that, makes you think you're sucking basically on a lemon and, your
Right.
eyes are
Yeah.
tearing. It really is it is a complex wine. It really is. Each time you taste it, each time you bring it up to your nose, there's different levels to it. It is definitely not unidimensional.
Mhm.
It's got loads of aromas. There is that grapefruit, lemon zest,
Mhm.
and a little bit of like a hay in a good way, um, but then on the palate, like you said, I kind of would expect that zing of acid, and
Mhm.
it's not in your face acid. It's acid that says, come take another sip. And going back to your cooking reference in terms of like adding an onion, what amazing it can do. It's almost
Right.
like the acid is like an MSG type thing where it's just enhancing everything that's in that glass. It's not taking on its own power. It's enhancing what is in there. So it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Now, you had mentioned that you don't really tend to do varietals, but your barrel distortion is
Mhm.
100% Albarino. So I am
Yes.
a I am a Rias Baixas like maniac. Like on my bucket list to go to Rias Baixas, like maniac. So I am an Albarino freak, and I will tell you that was the bottle I wanted to open today, but my husband was like, no, 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 you're going to open this one. This is what I feel like having. So that's why that one got open. Otherwise, the Albarino would have been the first one to go. So tell me about the Albarino. Where are you getting it from? What about Albarino? There's not a lot in the United States. There's some in Paso, but so why?
So, yeah, when my wife and I moved down here about 9 years ago, we'd never had an Albarino before, and we had a really nice bottle. And so, when I started planning this, that became a must-have variety because we both really enjoyed Albarino. And this again had its origin in my garage here. I got some fruit, some Albarino fruit from Bar Vineyard here in town, and started playing with it. And then when we started making it in production, we got a different vineyard called Plum Orchard Lane. It's in the Templeton Gap area of Paso. And, one thing people would always think, well, it's very different climate from what you have in Rias Baixas, for example, where it's cooler, it's more damp. Even though the Templeton Gap area is among the cooler areas within Paso, it's still quite a bit warmer and drier than what you would get in the homeland for Albarino. And I think some people tend to think, well, you look at, for example, Edna Valley, cooler area, probably more appropriate for that. But on the other hand, how do we know? Just because Albarino has been grown in Rias Baixas doesn't mean that's the only place it will be good. And so I've been really pleased, even though this part of Paso is warmer and drier than the native homeland. I've been really impressed with the fruit that we get and the quality of the flavors and things like that. It doesn't taste like your textbook Rias Baixas Albarino, which tend to be more acidic. A lot of them are done in big stainless tanks. They're a little bit more one-dimensional for my palate. But I've heard that a number of the top boutique producers in Rias Baixas are starting to do some of the same things that we've been doing. Not that they copied us, it was more coincidence, I'm sure. But a little bit of barrel fermentation, a little bit of lees exposure, a little bit of skin contact, that sort of thing. And this was one where I wanted to create an Albarino that had a little bit more character and complexity. And so we made, even though it is our only single variety wine, it's actually made up of about 5 different versions that were each made differently. So different neutral oak, French oak barrels, some stainless barrels. This one has some skin fermented component that I hand destemmed the fruit, hand crushed it, let it ferment on the skins until it was dry, and then pressed it off. And then there was a little bit that was carbonic macerated, which that derived from another wine that I made from the wine club, which was called the X2 and the X2A, which we have experimental wines where I do something sort of interesting and creative and call it an X wine. And if it comes out at all good, I'll release it to our wine club members. So this was the X2, X2A, which was the carbonic macerated Albarino. And then there's an X3, which is something totally different that'll be released here in a couple months.
It's incredible. Like, and you're saying, oh, well, I do something a little more experimental and a little bit more, like, all of your wines are so hands-on, creative, and experimental in a great way that it's almost funny to hear that you have, even in your eyes, something even more more experimental.
Well, the X3 is a totally different area. It's more of an exploration on texture and tannin structure in white wine. So it's skin fermented Viognier, it's other types of Viognier, it's got some Roussanne and some Grenache Blanc in it, and it's just a totally different wine, but it was a different thought experiment that was behind it.
Okay, so you also you had mentioned that in a website somewhere you have, not having a home vineyard means that we are free to source grapes from any of the grape vineyards. Now, you say that you have 400 miles. So your vineyards that you're sourcing from are spread all over the place. So I'm thinking you are, during harvest, right? It's all white. So you are probably fast and furious during harvest time to get the grapes in, and then to do all of these micro fermentation, fermenting, and then micro barrels and all of this. Like,
right.
Do you sleep during harvest? I mean, most winemakers, we don't sleep during harvest, but like, you really mustn't sleep.
Well, I don't have it as bad as it sounds, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, Riley, who I mentioned earlier, does a lot of the vineyard visits because she's got her own brand, Hubba Wines, and then she worked at Desperata. So she's out there a lot anyway. And so she checks on a lot of the vineyards for me, and that eases things up quite a bit. And then the actual winemaking occurs at Onyx's facility. And so their people do a lot of the legwork. I mean, I'm down there pretty much every day, and I provide directions on specifically exactly what I want to do on a barrel by barrel basis. But Drew and his team are fabulous, and they do a great job, first scratching their heads, I guess, at the nuttiness that I do, and then going ahead and doing it and doing a good job for me. So I appreciate all that. So I think as a result of all those things, I actually do get some sleep during harvest period, although it is a pretty busy time, of course.
Right. So tell me a little bit more about your Chenin Blanc. It's Jurassic Park Vineyard. So with a name like that, like, what's the story behind it? And I was looking into it a little bit, and it's like significantly different on the east side of that vineyard versus the west side, and in terms of that soil type. So tell us about the vineyard and why you're doing a Chenin in a varietal.
Yeah, so it's considered an old vines vineyard by California standards anyway, and certainly by white fruit California standards. I think a lot of it was planted back in the 1970s. And I don't know where the name came from either. I don't know whether that was before or after the movie franchise. If it was after, I'm a little surprised that nobody's been sued about it, but not my vineyard, not my problem, I guess. But yeah, they're kind of like pseudo head trained vines. They're old, and it's been a little hard to get some of the fruit as ripe as we would have at first liked it to be. And I think part of that is because the vines are old and they probably crop them a little higher than they could. But for whatever reason, we struggle to get much above 20 bricks on that fruit. But the flavors tend to come out pretty good. It also tends to have really nice acidity. And so when we blend it into some of the other things that provide a little bit more richness and body, then it all kind of works out. You have a good balance between the acidity level and some of the texture and body coming from other things. And then, of course, the aromatics come out from Chenin. And in this case, and neither here nor there, some of the aromatics also come from the skin fermented Sauvignon Blanc.
And did you come about finding the vineyards that you want to work with?
There are a couple of things there. When I was planning this, I spent two harvests plotting the daily high and daily low temperatures and rainfall amounts at about 20 different wine growing areas around the world, mainly France, Spain, and then up and down the California coast. And the thought process there was, if you're looking for, let's say, Chardonnay, you could say, well, the homeland for Chardonnay is the Burgundy region of France. What does the climate look like there? And how does that map to various points up and down the California coast? And you could do the same thing with Sauvignon Blanc or Albarino or Marsanne or whatever. And that will get you at least into the ballpark of where you want to start looking for good vineyards. At least that was my thinking. And then beyond that, you're really looking for vineyards that have a reputation for good farming practices and have had their fruit used in good wines previously, and then hope that you can talk them into selling some of it. And some of that, Riley and I leaned on some of the growers that, in the agricultural groups that we knew. Then we'd say, we want to have these particular varieties. Here's kind of where our thoughts are, where we'd like to look. What do you guys have? And then we kind of work with them. But we were really lucky to get really good vineyards right off the bat. And sometimes that's hard because a lot of the good vineyards are already spoken for. But I think the fact that both Riley and I had worked at some well-regarded wineries here in Paso probably helped our credibility. And I think a lot of the growers were probably intrigued by the notion of really trying to put a fine focus on making good white wines. And so for the vineyards that had white fruit in their vineyards, that was interesting for them.
So you and Excel must be like best friends. Right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
you would get along fantastically with my husband. He loves a spreadsheet for every single thing, whatever. And whenever I have to do anything data related, I pretty much just give him the information, and I'm like, "Here, honey, have a good night," and Excel it. He can do his spreadsheets. But you know what? That's important, and that's brilliant in my opinion. To if you want to make a Chardonnay, and it's Burgundy, then you're not going to go to a region. You're not going to find a vineyard in a region that doesn't have similar climate, microclimate, soils.
And that's one of the great things about the Central Coast is you can go 30 miles one way or the other and go from quite warm to quite cool. For those of us who live here, during the summertime, it might be 105 degrees in Paso, but you go over the hill to Cambria, which is about 30 miles away, and it would be 65. So it's pretty dramatic, but I think that's one of the advantages that I have in not owning my own vineyard, is that it does give me the opportunity to pick and choose and find all those places. And I think one of the things you see sometimes is someone has a vineyard and the owner will say, well, I really like Cabernet Sauvignon, but I also like Pinot Noir, and I like Chardonnay, and I like Riesling, and they try to shoehorn everything into the same vineyard. And, there's no vineyard that's going to be optimal for all those different varieties. And so you end up making trade-offs and compromises when you do that, versus being able to pick and choose and say, I'm going to go here for my Chardonnay, and I'm going to go there for my Sauvignon Blanc, and I'm going to go over here for my Albarino, for example.
True. Absolutely true. That it goes back to the old saying of, if you're a jack of all trades, you're a master of none, right? Same thing. So your tasting room is in Tin City, which we pretty much live in Tin City. And in order to go from your tasting room to Onyx, where your wines are made, you kind of have to veer past Barrel House. Are there frequent stops to Barrel House?
No, you actually don't have to go to Barrel House to get to Onyx.
You can see it, right?
It's not too far away. Yeah, everything is pretty close. But yeah, there's just a lot of good stuff going on in Tin City these days. And whether you're looking for wine or beer or cider or distilled spirits or ice cream, which has been known to be one of my haunts. I get sidetracked much more often by Negrante's Creamery than I do by Barrel House, actually.
Okay.
But, and then we got a couple of restaurants there now. McPhee's Cantina is now there, and of course, Six Test Kitchen. They only do dinner, And then there's usually a food truck or two in front of Barrel House. So there are more eating opportunities in the area than there were a couple of years ago, which is great.
I had read quite some time ago, which made me laugh, that the majority, they did some survey of winemakers, and they said that most winemakers, drink IPAs. And, and I was like, oh my God, Mike and I we both drink IPAs. Like that's our thing is an IPA. But it's really, I think it's more because you're of the red wine. You're tasting that red wine, you're tasting, and it's kind of equivalent to that IPA. So that's why I was wondering if your palate is more for your whites, which is why you're making these exceptional whites. I was wondering if that follows through to you also, but now it goes to the ice cream, so that's good.
Well, I mean, I do like beer, and it's interesting, as you probably know. You go in back when we could go out to restaurants and bars and things like that around here. When it seemed like whenever you met somebody, a winemaker that was hanging out at a restaurant or bar, they were usually drinking beer rather than wine. And at first, I think that's a surprise to people. But, when you're around wine all day long and you're drinking your wine and you're trying other people's wine and things like that, sometimes just relaxing with a beer is a nice break. And so you do tend to see a lot of winemakers when they're off hours actually drinking beer rather than drinking wine.
Right. Okay. So tell us, in Tin City, you come in, you're sharing a tasting room building basically with Turtle Rock, correct?
Turtle Rock and Kaleidos. So
okay.
we have, it's the front portion of this building. The same building also has the production area for Field Recordings Winery. And then in the very back is Six Test Kitchen, which is a very high-end, very interesting, creative, one of these 14-course tasting menu places. It's fabulous. They only serve about 12 people a night, but we are in the front section. So it's Monochrome, Turtle Rock, and Kaleidos. And we have some shared spaces, for example, the restroom, sink and stemware washer, cold storage area for bottled wine. But we each have our own separate tasting space, which is nice. And then, recently we're all having to pour outdoors, which is the case. So we've got a little patio out there. And so I've been doing all the tastings outdoors for most of the last 6 to 9 months.
And pre-COVID, let's go post-COVID. We're going to get there eventually. What is your typical policy for tasting? How can they get in to taste these wines?
So let's talk about pre-COVID, because we'll probably do something similar afterwards. But the inner space that we have, the inside tasting room, set it up basically for by appointment tasting. And my wife did a lot of the decor. And we really set it up aiming more for a vibe of sitting around a dinner table drinking wine with friends rather than standing at a bar somewhere. And so I personally lead all the tastings. I kind of walk people through the different wines, tell a little bit of backstory of Monochrome, and then really give them an opportunity to ask questions about the wines or the winemaking or anything like that. And the inside space, I can fit maybe 10 or 12 people max, something like that. So it's a fairly small, intimate group. Usually it's more between 4 and 8 people at a time, but it's all done by appointment. People can make appointments on the website, Monochrome website. Since COVID, we have a little patio, and so I've been doing all those tastings outdoors. We have 3 little tables, and I can accommodate 3 groups of up to about 5 or 6 people. And I try to do as much of the same thing outdoors as we would have done indoors. So I lead all the tastings. We have certain scheduled times, and then really, again, give people an opportunity to ask questions and learn a little bit more about wine and winemaking. So looking beyond COVID, we'll probably go to something where I maintain that model for indoor tastings, and then outdoor tastings. My wife and I have talked about maybe just having kind of a by the glass program outside where people can go outside and order a glass or 2 of wine and just hang out in the patio and enjoy the day.
And you had mentioned before we went on, you had mentioned that you are doing virtual tastings currently. So how can somebody do a virtual tasting with you?
So they can basically just go on the website, monochromewines.com, and you can order virtual tasting kits. And so we have they're little boxes of 5 2-ounce samples of 5 of our different wines. A couple of, well, two of the 3 that I sent you are in that kit. But it's kind of a good representative cross section of the wines that I make. And then they can go about booking a virtual tasting appointment, and we do it on Zoom. I lead all of those, and I try to do it maintaining as much as I can of the experience that you would have if you were to come to our tasting room in Paso. I lead people through the wines, talk a little bit about them, answer any questions that they might have as they taste the wines.
Okay, so basically they go on, they place an order, you send them the samples with information on how to schedule, and then they can schedule a time that is convenient for them. And
Correct.
okay, perfect,
Yeah.
perfect. And then
Yeah, the only thing that makes it a little bit complex is recently I've been able to do it a lot of different times. Once we get back to the tasting room, I'm doing the tastings in the tasting room Friday through Sunday from about 11 to 5. So that kind of blocks out those times. But other days, other evenings are all possibilities.
okay, so that was actually going to be my next question is in the tasting room, when we're back to normal, what are you're just Friday through Sunday?
Yeah, I've been Friday through Sunday from typically 11 to 5, although during the summertime when we were pouring outdoors, I shifted everything forward to start at 10 rather than 11, just to try to take advantage of the cooler mornings and not bake in the Paso sun when it was 105 in the afternoons.
Right. Okay. So my last question is, how can people find you? What is your website? Are you on social media? What is your, main social media site, and how can they get in contact with you?
So the website is monochromewines.com, plural wines. You can go on and you can send emails to me. They basically all come to me. I answer them personally. Social media, really primarily Instagram and Facebook. I do more on Instagram and then just sort of link it to Facebook. But I usually do that. And then, of course, I have a mailing list. And so I'll send out whenever we have a special offer going on or different news or an upcoming wine club release or something like that. I'll send out information to either the general mailing list or the wine club members about that information.
And do you want to talk about your wine club? What is
Yeah,
it entail?
so we have wine club, 2 releases per year. It's fall and spring. And you can either do Club 8, which is 2 releases of 4 bottles, or Club 16, which is 2 releases of 8 bottles. And I also try to give people the opportunity to customize their shipment if they want to. So each time I do a release, there's a default set of wines. It's typically half the new vintage. But I also send everybody information about the other wines that are still available. So if you did want to substitute this for that, or more of this and less for that, whatever, if you let me know, I can usually accommodate that. If I don't hear from you, then you get the default set of wines.
Okay.
And,
Excellent.
we have been having pickup parties where we have it catered by someone like La Cosecha, El Cortile, something like that. But obviously we haven't been able to do that the last several releases due to COVID concerns. Hopefully, it's clear we won't be able to do the spring release, but hopefully by next fall, we'll hopefully have made progress enough that we'll be able to get back to, to having actual pickup parties where we have groups together and let them taste through some of the wines.
Well, I just want to say thank you very much for sharing your wines, sharing your story. My husband, we're going to enjoy this bottle tonight. We're actually we're pairing it with cheese. So we're going to sit and actually relax and enjoy conversation, which is tough in as a hectic world as it is. But these wines will definitely be on my social media. This one, if the others are any indication, if this is any indication of the others, it's spectacular. It really is. It is very complex. And so I give you what your goal is being presented in that bottle. So thank you very much for taking your time and sharing your information. And one of these days when I'm walking around Tin City, we will pop in, we'll schedule an appointment so that we can sit down and talk in real life.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, thank you very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure to meet you, if only virtually, and certainly, hopefully you'll be able to stop by and we can meet in person sometime.
Absolutely. So thank you very much. Have a great Wine Wednesday.
Yeah, most of them are around here. So it's good about living in wine country.
This has been another episode of Exploring the Wineglass. Thanks for listening. If you have suggestions on what topics you would like me to discuss, please reach out on social media. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as Exploring the Wineglass. I'm also on LinkedIn as Lori Hoyt-Budd. Of course, you can always email me at exploringthewineglass@gmail.com. If you enjoyed what you heard, please rate, review, and subscribe to help others find me more easily. And most importantly, tell your wine-loving friends, because if you like the podcast, they will too. Music is Wine by Kevens. Until next week, Sláinte.
You are so special, you even in the Bible. Give me the red wine, give me the white wine, give me the sweet wine, give me